The general had been studying the losses for 6 weeks. Not the victories. The losses were the thing. The victories were comprehensible, which made them less interesting. You could look at a human victory and trace the sequence of decisions that had produced it and identify the moment where the superior choice had been made and understand why the choice was superior, and file the understanding in the appropriate analytical category. The victories were the product of good moves. Good moves were the product of good thinking. Good thinking was the product of training and experience and native capability, all of which could be assessed and categorized and incorporated into an opponent model. The losses were different. General Voth Koron of the Valith Sovereignty Strategic Planning Division had been given the task of developing the most comprehensive opponent model of human strategic cognition that the sovereignty had ever produced. The task had been assigned following the Keth 7 situation, following the managed pressure operation that had not produced the intended outcome, following the recommendation to the sovereignty's command that the existing models were insufficient, and that understanding Earth's strategic decision-making at a deeper level was necessary. He had started where everyone started, which was with the victories. He had reviewed every documented engagement involving Earth's military forces across 42 years of conclave membership. He had categorized the victories by type, by context, by the strategic conditions that had preceded them, by the decision points where Earth's choices had diverged from what the opponent had expected. After 3 weeks of the victories, he had understood them well enough to produce a preliminary model. The preliminary model said, Earth's forces demonstrate superior adaptability in dynamic conditions, exceptional capability for non-standard tactical solutions, and a consistent pattern of performing above projected capacity in situations of extreme pressure. The model was accurate. It was also, Koron understood when he read it back, the equivalent of describing a master chess player by saying they made good moves. It was true, and it was useless, because it did not tell you anything about what was going to happen next or how to address it, or what the underlying logic was that produced the good moves. He needed the losses. The losses were where the underlying logic was visible. A player who made good moves could be playing from any number of strategic frameworks. A player who made bad moves was showing you the actual shape of their thinking, the moments where the framework had produced the wrong output, the places where the model inside the player's head had diverged from the reality on the board, and you could see both at once and understand the gap. He pulled every documented loss involving Earth's military forces. There were fewer of them than the victories. Earth lost less often than it won. This was itself a data point of significance, and he noted it in the analytical record with the appropriate weight. But there were enough. He started reading. The first thing he noticed was that the losses were not randomly distributed across the types of engagements that Earth's forces had participated in. They clustered. The clustering was not obvious at first glance, because the surface conditions of the individual losses were varied enough that the pattern was not visible in the case-by-case review. He built a categorization matrix. He put every loss into the matrix against the variables he had identified as potentially significant: context, duration, force composition, opponent type, terrain, resource conditions, communication infrastructure, and 17 other variables that the strategic analysis literature said were relevant to engagement outcomes. He ran the analysis. The clustering became visible. Earth's losses clustered in situations that shared a specific characteristic. Not the obvious characteristics, not the situations where Earth was outgunned or outmaneuvered or caught in an unfavorable position. Those losses were comprehensible and distributed across the matrix without significant clustering. The clustered losses were in situations where Earth had won the tactical engagement and lost the strategic context. He looked at the cluster. He looked at it for a long time. He said to his aide, a meticulous officer named Thessaly who had been assigned to support the research, and who had been working through the same records from a different analytical angle. "I want you to look at something." She looked at the cluster. She said, "The tactical success cases." He said, "Yes." She said, "Earth wins the tactical engagement. The engagement produces an outcome that the tactical analysis says is a victory, and then something else happens." He said, "Something else happens." "Yes, what is the something else?" She pulled 3 cases from the cluster. She said, "In this case, Earth's forces defeated an opposing military formation in a contested corridor. The formation was destroyed. The corridor was secured. Standard tactical victory by every measure." She said, 6 weeks later, Earth withdrew from the corridor voluntarily. He said, "Why?" She said, "The engagement had produced significant civilian infrastructure damage in the corridor's inhabited systems. The damage had created a political context in which maintaining the corridor position was producing diplomatic costs that outweighed the strategic value of holding it." He said, "They won the battle and then surrendered the position because of what winning the battle had cost them in a different domain." She said, "Yes." She said, "In this case, Earth's forces successfully defended a planetary installation against an attack that was significantly larger than the defending force. Exceptional tactical performance by every measure. The installation was held." She said, 4 months later, Earth negotiated a significant concession to the attacking party. He said, "They held the installation and then gave up something else." She said, "The concession was in a trade negotiation that had been ongoing before the attack. The attack had changed the political dynamics of the negotiation. The party that had attacked had sustained significant losses and had a domestic political need to show something from the engagement. Earth's negotiators read this and provided the concession in the trade negotiation as a face-saving mechanism that resolved the political problem without conceding anything of strategic value." He said, "They gave something up in one context to resolve a problem in another context, and the thing they gave up cost them less than letting the problem continue." She said, "Yes." He said, "And the third case?" She said, "In this case, Earth's forces engaged and destroyed a piracy operation that had been raiding civilian shipping in a remote corridor. Successful elimination of the threat. The piracy operation ceased. Standard successful intervention." She said, 3 years later, the corridor had significantly worse piracy problems than before. He said, "Explain." She said, "The eliminated piracy operation had been run by a specific organization with a specific internal discipline structure. The elimination of the operation destroyed the organization. The destruction of the organization left the corridor's criminal ecosystem without the specific internal discipline that the organization's structure had maintained. Multiple smaller and less organized groups filled the vacuum. The smaller groups were individually less capable than the original organization, but collectively more disruptive, because they lacked the coordination that had made the original organization manageable." He said, "They destroyed the organized threat and produced a disorganized threat that was worse." She said, "Yes." He said, "And they knew this was going to happen." She said, "The post-action analysis in Earth's own military records acknowledges that the corridor dynamics were discussed before the operation. There is a documented dissent from one of the planning team members who predicted exactly this outcome." He said, "Who was the dissent from?" She pulled the record. She said, "Lieutenant Commander Designation, Human Affairs Liaison." The dissent was filed and noted, and the operation proceeded. He said, "It proceeded despite an internal prediction that it would produce the worse outcome." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She said, "The political context at the time required a visible response to the piracy. The civilian shipping interests affected by the piracy had political representation that was producing pressure on Earth's decision-making structure. The visible response addressed the political pressure. The longer-term corridor dynamics were a known cost that was assessed as more manageable than the political cost of not responding. He said, they made a choice they knew was going to produce a bad outcome because the alternative produced a different bad outcome that was worse in the short term. She said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, these are not losses in the conventional sense. She said, no. He said, they are not situations where Earth's forces were outmaneuvered or outgunned, or made the wrong tactical choice. She said, in many of these cases, Earth made the optimal tactical choice given the constraints at the time of the decision. He said, the constraints at the time of the decision. She said, yes. He said, which were not the full set of constraints. She said, the full set of constraints was not visible at the time of the decision from the position of the decision maker. Some of the constraints were visible only in retrospect. Some were visible in advance but not to the decision maker. Some were visible to specific people who had the information but not the authority, or the authority but not the information. He said, they lost because the decision maker could not see the whole board. She said, that is one way to describe it. He said, describe it another way. She said, they lost because the game being played was larger than the game being measured. The tactical engagement was a game that could be measured. The strategic context was a game that could not be fully measured at the time decisions were being made. The decisions that produced what we are calling losses were optimal for the measured game and suboptimal for the unmeasured game. He said, the unmeasured game. She said, yes. He said, what is the unmeasured game? She said, that is the question I have been trying to answer for 6 weeks. He said, and she said, I think the unmeasured game is not a specific game. I think it is a property of how humans play any game. He said, explain. She said, every documented human strategic thinker, across every domain and every period of Earth's history that we have records of, exhibits a consistent characteristic. They play the game in front of them, and they play a different game at the same time. The different game is not the same game at a larger scale. It is a different kind of game. It has different rules and different winning conditions and different time horizons. He said, they are always playing 2 games. She said, at minimum, sometimes more. He said, and the losses occur when the games conflict. She said, the losses occur when the requirements of one game produce choices that cost something in another game that was not fully visible when the choice was made. He said, and the victories. She said, the victories occur when the requirements of the games align, when the optimal choice in one game is also the optimal choice in the others. When winning the battle wins the war, wins the peace, wins the political context, wins the 30-year relationship. When all the games point in the same direction. He said, and Earth's exceptional strategic performance is explained by. She said, by the fact that they are playing more games simultaneously than their opponents and winning across more of them. The cases that look like exceptional performance are cases where Earth identified alignment across multiple games that the opponent did not know were being played. He said, they win because they see a board the opponent does not know exists. She said, yes. He said, and they lose when they cannot see their own board completely. She said, yes. He said, the losses are not failures of capability. She said, no. He said, they are failures of visibility. She said, they are situations where the board they could not see was the board that mattered. He was quiet for a long time. He pulled up the preliminary model he had written after 3 weeks of analyzing the victories. He read it. He said, superior adaptability in dynamic conditions, exceptional capability for non-standard tactical solutions, consistent pattern of performing above projected capacity in situations of extreme pressure. He said, this is wrong. Thessaly said, it is not wrong, it is. He said, incomplete. She said, yes. He said, it describes the surface. She said, it describes the performance output. It does not describe the mechanism that produces the output. He said, the mechanism is the multiple games. She said, the mechanism is the awareness of multiple games, and the ability to identify when the games align and move decisively in the direction of alignment. He said, and when they do not align. She said, when the games do not align, they face the same problem everyone faces, which is choosing which game to prioritize with incomplete information about what the choice will cost in the games they are not prioritizing. He said, and they sometimes prioritize wrong. She said, they sometimes cannot see the game they are deprioritizing clearly enough to accurately assess the cost. He said, which produces the losses. She said, which produces what we have been calling losses. Yes. He said, but the losses are actually. She said, evidence that the unmeasured game existed and was larger than the measured game. He said, they lost the battle to show us the war. She said, they did not intend to lose the battle to show us the war. They lost the battle because the war was not fully visible, but the result is that the loss reveals the war. He said to us. She said to us, yes. He said, we have been studying their losses to understand their strategic thinking. She said, yes. He said, and their losses are showing us the games they're playing that we cannot see. She said, the losses are the places where the games became visible because the games conflicted. Yes. He looked at the analysis. He looked at the cluster of losses that he had been studying for 6 weeks. He said, Thessaly. She said, yes. He said, if the losses show us the games they are playing that we cannot see, and if we have been studying the losses, and if we now understand the structure of the multiple games. She said, yes. He said, then we understand something about their strategic framework that we did not understand before. She said, yes. He said, and the question is what we do with that understanding. She said, yes. He said, what do you think we do with it? She said, I think we add it to the opponent model. I think the model gets significantly more accurate with this analysis. I think we can predict Earth's strategic behavior better than we could before because we understand the mechanism. He said, yes. He said, and. She said, and. She was quiet for a moment. She said, and I am not sure the better prediction changes anything operationally. He said, explain. She said, the better prediction tells us which game Earth is going to prioritize in a given situation. It tells us which game they might deprioritize. It tells us where the visibility gaps might be that could produce the kind of loss we have been studying. She said, but exploiting a visibility gap in Earth's strategic awareness requires us to be playing the game that they cannot see, and identifying which game that is requires us to be able to see more games simultaneously than they can. He said, and. She said, and Earth's framework for playing multiple simultaneous games has been developing for 42 years of conclave membership, and significantly longer before that. The framework is the product of 11,000 years of a history that required playing multiple simultaneous games to survive. The framework is not a strategy. It is a property of how they think. He said, we are trying to out-multiple game a species that has been playing multiple games simultaneously for 11,000 years. She said, yes. He said, using an analysis based on their losses. She said, yes. He said, which they produced by playing multiple games simultaneously with incomplete information. She said, yes. He said, so the losses we studied. She said, were produced by the same framework we are now trying to use against them. He said, and the framework is not a strategy that we can adopt. She said, the framework is a product of their history. You cannot adopt a product of 11,000 years of history by studying it for 6 weeks. He said, what can we do with 6 weeks of studying it? She said, we can understand it better than we did. He said, She said, and understand our own framework better than we did. He said, what do you mean? She said, the analysis shows us the structure of how they play. It also shows us, by contrast, the structure of how we play. We play fewer simultaneous games. We have better visibility within the games we play. We make more accurate decisions within the games we can see. She said, we are more precise within our board. He said, and they are. She said, more comprehensive across more boards. He said, different frameworks. She said, different strengths, different vulnerabilities. He said, our strength is precision. Their strength is comprehensiveness. She said, yes. He said, our vulnerability is the games we are not playing. She said, yes. He said, and their vulnerability is the visibility gaps in the games they are playing. She said, yes. He said, and the way to address their strength is not to adopt their framework because we cannot. She said, the way to address their strength is to identify the games they are playing that we are not and develop the capacity to play them. He said, which takes. She said, longer than 6 weeks. He said, yes. He looked at the analysis again. He thought about the cluster of losses and the multiple games and the unmeasured board and the visibility gaps and the framework that was not a strategy but a property of how they thought. He thought about the chess metaphor he had been using in his own thinking to organize the analysis, the idea of seeing the board, the idea of the game. He thought about what the analysis had told him about that metaphor. He said, the metaphor is wrong. Thessaly said, which metaphor? He said, chess. She said, in what way? He said, chess is a closed game. Both players can see the full board. Both players have complete information about all the pieces. The game is about who thinks better with the same information. He said, what the analysis shows is that Earth is not playing chess. She said, what are they playing? He said, something where the board is not fully visible to anyone, where both players can see parts of the board and not other parts, and the parts they cannot see contain pieces that can change the outcome, and where the skill is not in thinking better with the same information, but in seeing more of the board than the opponent knows exists. She said, a game of incomplete information where the skill is the completeness of the information. He said, and the framework for developing that completeness is the product of 11,000 years of playing the game with incomplete information and learning to function anyway. She said, yes. He said, and we have been trying to understand their game by studying their losses. She said, yes. He said, which is exactly the kind of analysis that you would do if you were playing chess. She said, studying what went wrong to improve future play. Yes. He said, because in chess you can see the board. She said, yes. He said, and in the game they are actually playing. She said, the losses do not show you the board. They show you the edges of the board. The places where the part they could not see was revealed by the cost of not seeing it. He said, we have been studying the edges. She said, yes. He said, thinking we were studying the board. She said, yes. He looked at the analysis. He looked at 6 weeks of meticulous work on the losses. He said, is the analysis useful? She said, yes. He said, what is it useful for? She said, it is useful for understanding what questions to ask. We now know that the relevant question is not what game is Earth playing, but how many games is Earth playing, and which ones are we not seeing? He said, and to answer those questions. She said, we need to play the games we are not currently playing. He said, to develop the framework. She said, yes. He said, over time. She said, yes. He said, and in the interim. She said, "In the interim, we have a significantly more accurate opponent model and a significantly better understanding of why our previous models were insufficient." He said, "Because they were chess models." She said, "Because they were models of a closed game being applied to an open game." Yes. He said, "And the sovereignty's strategic planning has been built on chess models." She said, "The sovereignty's strategic planning has been built on frameworks optimized for the games the sovereignty has been playing. Those are not the same games Earth has been playing." He said, "No." He said, "And the recommendation?" She said, "The recommendation is to develop the capacity to play more simultaneous games, to expand the strategic planning framework to include games that are currently outside it, to build the institutional knowledge of how to function with incomplete information rather than how to minimize the incompleteness." He said, "You are recommending we become more like them." She said, "I am recommending we develop the capacity they have. The way they developed it was specific to their history, and we cannot replicate the developmental path, but the capacity itself can be cultivated." He said, "How long?" She said, "I do not know, longer than we would like." He said, "Yes." He said, "Write it up, full analysis. The cluster, the multiple games framework, the chess model critique, the recommendations." He said, "And include the cases, all of them. I want the sovereignty's command to understand the specific cases, because the specific cases are where the framework becomes visible." She said, "Yes." He said, "And Thessaly?" She said, "Yes." He said, "The lieutenant commander, the one who filed the dissent on the piracy operation?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Find the full record. What happened after the dissent was overruled?" She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the dissent was the correct analysis. The lieutenant commander saw the unmeasured game. The decision makers could not see what the lieutenant commander saw." He said, "I want to understand why they could see it and the decision makers could not. That gap, the individual who sees the game that others cannot see, that is the mechanism at its most visible." He said, "If I can understand how one person develops the capacity to see the board that others cannot see, I can understand how the framework develops at the individual level." She said, "And from the individual level?" He said, "To the institutional level, yes." She said, "Yes, Commander." She pulled the record. The record showed that the lieutenant commander had filed the dissent, that the dissent had been noted, that the operation had proceeded, that the outcome had been as the dissent predicted, and that the lieutenant commander's personnel file had a notation from 3 years after the operation that read, "Demonstrated exceptional strategic foresight in the Keth Corridor Assessment. Recommend for advanced strategic planning positions." He read the notation. He said, "They noted it." Thessaly said, "Yes." He said, 3 years later?" She said, "Yes." He said, "The person who saw the board that others could not see was identified and advanced." She said, "Yes." He said, "The system recognized the capacity and cultivated it." She said, "Yes." He said, "How did the system know what it was recognizing?" She said, "I think the system knew because 3 years later the outcome was visible, and the outcome matched the dissent." He said, "The dissent was validated by the outcome, and the validation made the capacity visible." She said, "Yes." He said, "And the system cultivated it because?" She said, "Because the system was built by people who understood that the capacity to see the unmeasured game is the strategic asset, that the person who can see the game others cannot see is more valuable than the person who plays the visible game better than anyone else." He said, "They built a system that identifies and cultivates the capacity to see the unmeasured game." She said, "Yes." He said, "By learning from the losses." She said, "By finding the people who saw the losses coming and listening to them after the loss confirmed the seeing." He said, and then building institutions to produce more of those people. She said, yes. He said, we have been studying their losses to build a better opponent model. She said, yes. He said, and what their losses are actually doing is building better strategic thinkers. She said, what their losses are doing is identifying the people who saw the game others could not see and elevating them within the system, and using the accumulated dissents and predictions and institutional memory to teach the next generation of strategic thinkers to see more of the board. He said, the losses are teaching tools. She said, the losses are the most honest feedback the system gets. They cannot be explained away. They cannot be attributed to bad luck or unusual circumstances. They require the system to look at what was not seen. He said, and looking at what was not seen. She said, develops the capacity to see it. He said, over generations. She said, yes. He said, and we have been looking at their losses. She said, yes. He said, and developing. She said, a better understanding of the games we are not playing. He was quiet for a long time. He said, we are doing exactly what their system does. She said, yes. He said, by studying their losses. She said, yes. He said, we are learning to see the board they were seeing when they lost. She said, yes. He said, and they built a system to do that deliberately. She said, and we have arrived at the same place accidentally. He said, by doing what any opponent does when they want to understand a competitor. She said, yes. He said, which is what they built their system to do. She said, yes. He said, the system is designed to produce the analysis we have just done. She said, the system produces people who can do this analysis naturally, as a function of how they think, without 6 weeks of deliberate study. He said, and we have done it in 6 weeks through deliberate study. She said, and arrived at conclusions that took them 11,000 years to build into their framework. He said, except we arrived at them analytically. She said, yes. He said, and they arrive at them. She said instinctively, as a product of the framework, without the analysis. He said, there is a difference. She said, a significant one. He said, what is the difference? She said, the difference is that analytical conclusions require a new analysis for each new situation. Instinctive conclusions from an embedded framework are available immediately in real time without the analysis. He said, they do not need 6 weeks to see the unmeasured game. She said, their framework produces the seeing in real time. He said, and we need 6 weeks. She said, yes. He said, and in the 6 weeks. She said, the situation has moved. He looked at the analysis. He said, write it up. She said, yes. He said, all of it. She said, yes. He said, and Thessaly. She said, yes. He said, at the end, the conclusion section. She said, yes. He said, write a section called What We Should Do About This. She said, and what should it say? He thought about it. He said, it should say that we have done exactly what we needed to do, and the result is that we understand the problem better than we did. He said, and it should say that understanding the problem is not the same as solving the problem. He said, and it should say that the solving requires developing the framework, and the framework requires time. He said, and it should say that in the time it takes to develop the framework, Earth will continue to play the games we cannot see. He said, and that the most useful thing we can do in the immediate term is not to try to play the games we cannot see, but to identify the people in our own system who can see more of the board than others, the way their system identifies them. She said, by looking for the dissents. He said, by looking for the dissents, yes. She said, the people who saw what others could not see. He said, who filed the dissent and were overruled and were right. She said, yes. He said, and listening to them. She said, yes. He said, write that. She said, yes, Commander. She wrote it. The report was 61 pages. It went to the Sovereignty's Strategic Planning Command on a Thursday. The command read it over the following week. The command's response was a single document. The document said, the analysis is accepted. The recommendations are accepted. Effective immediately, the Strategic Planning Division will establish a dissent review process to identify officers whose predictions were accurate and whose predictions were overruled. These officers will be identified, their full records reviewed, and their subsequent assignments will be reconsidered in light of the demonstrated capacity to see strategic factors that others could not. The document also said, the report's conclusion that the Sovereignty has been conducting opponent analysis using a chess model for an open game is noted, and is the most significant finding in the report. The command will initiate a review of all existing opponent models to assess which ones are subject to the same limitation. The document ended. The command notes that the analysis was produced by studying Earth's losses. The command further notes that this is, as the report observes, exactly what Earth's own system is designed to produce. The command recommends that the analysis team consider what this means for the ongoing relationship between the Sovereignty's strategic planning and Earth's strategic framework. Coron read the final paragraph. He said to Thessaly, they read the last section. She said, yes. He said, and they are asking what we should make of the fact that we arrived here by doing what Earth's system does. She said, yes. He said, what do we make of it? She said, I think we make of it that Earth built a system to produce this kind of thinking, and we have done this kind of thinking accidentally, and the difference between accidentally and systematically is the difference between us and them. He said, and the way to close that difference, she said, is to make it systematic. He said, which requires. She said, time. He said, yes. He said, and in the meantime. She said, in the meantime we have 61 pages that we produced by studying their losses. He said, and they will study our analysis. She said, if they obtain it. He said, they will obtain it. They obtain everything eventually. She said, yes. He said, and when they study our analysis. She said, they will see that we have correctly identified the structure of their framework. He said, and. She said, and they will update the framework to account for the fact that we have correctly identified it. He said, because the framework is designed to incorporate feedback. She said, yes. He said, even feedback from opponents who have studied the framework. She said, the dissent review process, the loss analysis, the institutional memory, all of it is designed to incorporate information about what was not seen. Our analysis of their framework is information about what we can see. When they see what we can see, they will update what they see. He said, we studied their losses to understand their framework. She said, yes. He said, and when they read our analysis. She said, our analysis becomes one of their losses, a loss of invisible advantage, a visibility gap that we found. He said, and they will incorporate it. She said, yes. He said, and the framework will update. She said, yes. He said, to account for the fact that we can now see what they were doing. She said, yes. He said, and we will need to do the analysis again. She said, yes. He said, because the framework will have moved. She said, yes. He said, and we will always be 6 weeks behind. She said, unless we develop the capacity to see the board in real time. He said, which requires. She said, time. He said, 11,000 years of time. She said, approximately, yes. He said, we do not have 11,000 years. She said, no. He said, what do we have? She said, we have 61 pages and a dissent review process, and a command that has understood the problem. He said, "Is that enough?" She said, "It is a beginning." He said, "Beginnings are useful." She said, "Yes." He said, "File the report." She said, "It is already filed." He said, "Yes." He said, "And Thessaly?" She said, "Yes." He said, "The chess model?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I want you to learn chess." She said, "Commander." He said, "Earth's chess, the game they play, learn it." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because they built an entire strategic culture around thinking about strategy using that game as a model, and the model is a closed information game, and they are actually playing an open information game, and there is a gap between the model they use to teach themselves, and the game they actually play, and that gap is interesting." He said, "The gap between the model and the game might be where the framework is." She said, "Where it developed?" He said, "Yes." He said, "If you learn to play chess, you will see how the closed game model shapes the thinking, and then you will look at how the open game differs, and the difference might tell us something." She said, "About how they developed the capacity to move from the closed model to the open game." He said, "About how you learn to see the board that the model does not show you." She said, "Yes." He said, "Learn it." She said, "Yes, Commander." She learned it. It took her 3 months. At the end of 3 months, she came back to his office and she said, "I understand the game." He said, "And?" She said, "And I understand why it produces the thinking it produces." He said, "Explain." She said, "Chess is a game where you can see everything, where the full information is available, where the skill is in seeing further ahead than the opponent within the complete information." She said, "And playing chess teaches you to believe that the full information is available." He said, "Yes." She said, "And then you play the actual game, and the full information is not available." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the chess habit says, I am missing something visible. I need to look harder at what is in front of me to see what I am missing." He said, "Yes." She said, "But what is missing is not visible. It is in the unmeasured game." He said, "Yes." She said, "So the chess habit sends you looking in the wrong place." He said, "Looking harder at the visible board." She said, "When the thing you need is on the board you cannot see." He said, "And the framework?" She said, "The framework is what you develop when you play chess long enough to realize that the world does not work like chess, and that the missing thing is not on the board in front of you." He said, "And then?" She said, "And then you start looking for the board you cannot see." He said, "Which is what we did." She said, "Which is what we did." He said, "And what they have been doing." She said, "For 11,000 years." He said, "Yes." He said, "Write it up, add it to the analysis, the chess observation." She said, "Yes, Commander." She wrote it up. The updated analysis was 73 pages. It went back to Command. Command read it. Command sent one response. The response said, "We have approved the budget for a chess program in the Strategic Planning Division's training curriculum." Koran read the response. He said, "They are going to teach our strategic planners chess." Thessaly said, "Yes." He said, "So they can learn to see the board they cannot see." She said, "So they can learn to notice when the board they can see is not the whole board." He said, "The way Earth's planners noticed." She said, "The way Earth's planners learn to notice." Yes. He said, "By playing the closed game until they understood it was a closed game." She said, "And then asking what the open game looks like." He said, "Yes." He said, "How long will it take?" She said, "To develop the full capacity, time." He said, "How much time?" She said, "I do not know. Less than 11,000 years if we are deliberate about it." He said, "And more than we would like." She said, "Yes." He said, "Yes." He said, "And in the meantime?" She said, in the meantime we play chess. He said, yes. He said, and study their losses. She said, and study our analysis of their losses. He said, which has become one of their losses. She said, and which they are now studying. He said, yes. He said, and the game continues. She said, yes. He said, on more boards than we can see. She said, yes. He said, but more boards than we could see 6 weeks ago. She said, yes, Commander, more boards than 6 weeks ago. He said, that is something. She said, it is a beginning. He said, yes. He said, it is a beginning.